I've gotten a number of interesting comments from Kofi, and I don't think I've really ever even begun to address a significant number of them. Some of them I think are. I think it was Kofi who said I speak too fast, and some of them look like they might be related to that, and so I thought it was useful to clarify. And a number of the questions are about line. So, and I just got another one from Susan K, who's asking what is a floating line. And I mention the floating line all the time. I did a video on starting a charcoal drawing, and I show you there what those things are that I do. I float, a top point and a bottom point, those sorts of things. I set them out there like that, and those are floating. But so you can look at that video, which I'll put the number up for you, and then. But I'll talk about it anyway, Susan K. And in the meantime, let's read this. Let's read my questions from Kofi and from Susan, and then let's show you just a few pictures. I'm going to show you just a handful, all of which have something related to these several points. So the first question that Kofi puts out there is, what is the innocent line? And then how do I make an innocent line? Now, just starting right off, Kofi, I don't use that word. I use the word innocent eye. If I did say innocent line, I'd have to look at it and get the context, but I don't think I've ever used that expression. But the innocent eye simply means one that doesn't have thoughts from the past involved in it. It means you're seeing a shape for the first time and drawing exactly what you see. And you're always trying to maintain that clarity, just draw what you see, just exactly what you see, nothing but what you see, and get it right in its relationships to other things. So I'm just going to push that aside that way, okay, because I think you just misunderstood me. But if we talked about the innocent eye or the naive eye, when we talk about Meldrum, when we talk about Monet, and anything to do with the Boston School, these guys all get that. You have to see without knowing what things are. In other words, what we talk about is value relationships. So it's angles, whatever it is. For example, you draw the line around a figure, but you don't do it from ideas about anatomy that you have in your head. You look at the line, draw the line you see. All right. And then he says, what do you mean by a memorized line, virtually traced? And let me read through this part here, and then I'll come back and show you what I'm talking about. But what do you mean by a memorized line, virtually traced? And what would Degas have memorized a line that described a flat shape, or would he have memorized the forms, which he could later draw lines from, or both, and traced from what? So those are good questions, and I presume a whole bunch of kind of experience and knowledge when I do these things, and I shouldn't. It's one of the difficulties of speaking to a really wide crowd, and frankly, I don't know that I expect anybody to know what I'm talking about, because so few people today work the way I do. There are a few out there that do and have an idea what I'm talking about just in general. And then he says, you mentioned in the video that Fetchin fell under the category of using a memorized line that was traced. I'm very curious about what you have to say about his drawings. He's another one of my favorites. And I know I've talked about Fechin before, and I did that for you, Kofi, but I'm trying to just get this idea out of the way of the idea of a memorized line or a traced line, okay? And I haven't talked about that before in isolation. So I'm seeing more and more that I mention a lot of things, and I appreciate that when you all come back to me, you narrow it down to one of the elements in the conversation I had that maybe lacked clarification. Keep doing that, okay? I don't mind that these videos get narrower and narrower. I don't even mind if they get shorter. That would be nice. It's not always easy just because you go into a smaller area. If you dig in, it can take just as long as when you broadly cover the general area. So, and then Susan asked what a floating line is. So I'm going to just go to the first set of these things, and I think I'm going to talk. Let's just see what I talk about. I've got two things in mind, right? What's traced line. Let's go down and just look at the floating line first. I think that's going to be the easiest. I'm sorry, I'm not really on top of it here. All right. So if I show you these images, and you have, oops. Well, actually, let's leave that with Paxson for a second. Paxson's the guy who mentioned the idea of a floating line, right? Now, here's a study, I think, for Coolidge or Grover Cleveland. I don't know who this president is that he's got the job of portraying. But here he's doing a preliminary line drawing, which is obviously, in the case of the head and hands, he's begun to work up a bit. And if you look closely, and I'm hoping you can, you'll see like from the back of his neck here, the back of his jacket thing. You see from here, the line is not connected to this line, to the neckline. It's just floating, right? Here it comes down, and there it ends, right there again. Floating. Here's another one floating, right? This one here is just sitting there, right? Floating. Any number of these are just doing that. They're floating, right? And the rest of his point was, and anybody can actually close in later on, and if they choose to. Now you come around something like this, and you're going to close in, right? Because that's just, the whole thing is a mass with a contour on it that's closed relatively. But that's the thing I want you to see. That's the floating line. So when you're talking about these guys, this is Benson now. Have a look at some of the lines in the head. And one thing I'll say about the floating line, by the way, it is a prospective line. You send it out there. I call it sending out the scouts. You send the line out there and have a look at it. And so the earliest ones, and the ones that are sometimes available for you to see are very light, and they're very short, or relatively short. They're just tentative. They're trying to locate something, trying to locate an event, typically a point, or the bend in a shape, or something like that, that is useful for making locations. So, and let's just say, for the sake of talking about the Paxson thing, this would be a closed line. This would be sometime later when he would have closed this line here. He wouldn't have started making this thing really perfect that way and then tried to fit other things in. He would have floated a great many lines around. So let's look at the top here, and there's the one there. There's one right there. Yeah, back here you'll see a couple little things. These are lines that are basically set out there, and he would have done it any place. If you're trying to find out where this cheek is, you'll set a line there. You won't draw your way inching along, right? That's a key difference. You're setting out placeholders, and they are typically, the way we work, they are typically a real shape of something you really see. Okay, so let's go back up then to now this is Fetchin on the left, and these are two from Augustus John. Now, this is a preliminary, or I should say a cartoon-like scribble. But you can see he's done that. He's floated a cheek. He's floated a long line here. And that's, by the way, Sargent, who talks about, I think he talks about at the Slade, the idea of drawing the longest line you can. He's talking about in paint, I believe. But you'll see that there are these various points, placeholders, right, that are drawn and left floating. They aren't connected. And if they are connected, it'll be later. So you'll see even the very points on the nose, float, right? You can see that he's trying to put down tentative marks and find locations. And he'll be, of course, when he finds something like that, he'll be lining it up with something. He'll be getting it right in line with something else. He'll be doing its job. It'll be out there. But one of the things we do as a visual person is we speculate. And by the way, as a person who draws with our eyes, we put things out and we watch them to what we know for sure, like top and bottom, and we move them until they feel right in relation, right? But we also follow the model of drawing this shape so it looks like nature, and use a shape that really looks like nature. And if you move it, make it look even more like nature, okay? And you'll see that's not uncommon at all in these kinds of people's work. So you'll see some of the very same things in this slide. You'll see the hat in this slide. You see right there is a speculative line on that hat. Do you see that? And eventually the line goes way up here, right? So there's a number of those, just scouting lines, okay? But think of them floating just means they're not connected into a tight, long, continuous line. At some point, he may do that or he may not. Line drawings typically the purpose of them is rather in the category of sketches. People, sometimes people like even Fetchin, at some point will turn them into sort of, art drawings. I'm just going to say a portrait drawing or something like that. And And so there will be a desire or maybe even a need from the point of view of a form of finish to make the portrait, to close out the portrait, so to speak, which this didn't require, right? But there may be that desire to make it more of a finished product, more noodled, whatever. Angs are very nice for that, but they're not good for what I'm talking about now, even though he undoubtedly did it. So Fechin did a lot of those. But again, I want to show you just some spots where you can see him speculating. So see the line right there under the leg, right? That's a speculative line, and you can see it doesn't have it's not closed with another line. It runs into one that's cutting away from it. But there's a whole lot of speculative lines out here. Usually drawn very lightly, it's dark enough for you to see, but light enough for you to not interfere with the future of your drawing, the nice look of the future of your drawing. So that's that point. I don't know if I need to say more on that one. Everybody's doing it. Degas, everybody's doing it. They're drawing a long line and they're speculating with it. Look at the back of the dress here. There's any number of speculative lines sitting there. And that's going to be true everywhere. Look at the hand. There's two hands there. It's typical of, but it's also true that these guys are drawing not with hacks and hacks, looking for a place to finally draw, but they're actually locating by means of the look of nature, okay? Which gets us toward the memorized line that Kofi was asking about. I'll come back to the floating line if it occurs to me to do so, but I'd just soon move over now to the idea of a traced line. What I'm talking about when I say as if it were traced, I'm saying they virtually memorized a line. And even in the early phase of it, like this here, you can see by the look of this line coming down the back of the dress here that it's actually seen. You don't just make up stuff like that. It came down, made a point, came up and made a couple bends and then traveled down. It looks like a line that would have been a piece of nature. He went, he would have been, every time he drew, he would have been drawing what he saw. People don't, these kinds of draftsmen, guys who are working with their eyes, drawing what they see, aren't doing anything else. The people who invent figures are in a different category, right? By the way, the people who invent figures should be even more emboldened to use speculative lines, to float lines around, to begin to see the figure before they close it in. And so I'd highly recommend that to those who haven't figured that out yet. What else can I show you on this one? Yeah, you can see on the back of the dress that these things don't look like chance. This is real shape making, right? And so in the same sense as I'm saying before, they're memorized lines. You'll see that with virtually any line you see, it looks like a seen line. And so in that sense, I mean traced, okay? Let's see if there's anything else I can say that'll make it clearer to you. Yeah, when their drawing is more finished, it's a little more difficult to understand that, but let's see where would be a good point to talk about that. It's funny. It's funny, these guys aren't inventors, you know what I mean? Even the line, say, this right here at this cuff here, that looks like a seen line, and as if it were traced, as if the guy, and so does this one. Actually, you can see how much content there is in this already. But those kinds of lines are, as it were, memorized. But I say traced, and so now that gets us to this question that was being asked about, would Degas have been created some sort of form in some way, put down the forms, and then traced around them? Well, just look at pictures. Just look at a lot of pictures. You won't see any evidence of that whatsoever. Everything I'm talking about is the outline of a, in this case, an object, right? Or it's the outline of something. It's the outline of a flat pattern. And the form is glued on. The modeling is added, okay? It's, ultimately when you're a good painter, you're doing both at the same time. You put a significant number of linear stuff down. You begin to get form moving. In the midst of it, ideas like the turn here might be there as you're still improving this shape right here, if you follow what I'm saying. So no, there's no way in the world he was putting down form first. Now, the reason you think of that, though, is because I was looking at the Fechin, and you can see Fetchin doing blobbing, sort of cruddy blobs of midtone on here to highly suggest smoke-like form, the sfumato sort of thing. And in this one, possibly even in this one, but typically you could also see then lines coming down after the form was set up. So this is a larger expression of form. It's not finely noodled form. But so that's not an unusual thing to actually, in his case, he probably, by the way, I'm sure he just got the line moving first. That's just who he was. But then this idea of expressing the beauty of that form, then come back and reinventing your line with that new sense of things. So there's a back and forth like that you'll find just marvelously useful and informing, counter-informative, cross-informative. I have to go back and ask what the other question was I might have missed. I do, by the way, love his line quality. Fetchin's, the fineness of those lines is really quite something to behold. And I don't know, I'm guessing that possibly some of them were silver point, which is people who, speaking of falling, but fall into the spell of Leonardo, might use silver point. And it seems to me Fechin did to some degree. I'm thinking possibly of Anagonia or somebody else like that as well. Yeah, so traced from what? I can do that. I mean, we're talking about really not literally traced as if you put a piece of glass up there. But the shapes are so like that it is as if they were traced on glass, like that. And I just said about Holbein, his almost feel like they were. I mean, I can't pretend. I still sit there and wonder about that. But in the case of these guys here, there's no way in the world they're sitting there tracing on glass. They're drawing these things on pieces of paper. And so what I mean by tracing with these guys is I do mean as if they traced, okay? So as if the contour is run so clean and so simply that it is as if it were traced. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. So Degas, would Degas have memorized a line that described a flat shape? Yes. Would he have memorized the forms? Yes, but I don't see any evidence he would have memorized the forms and later drew lines somehow from forms. That's something you need to think through, and maybe you're formulating the question in a way that doesn't come across. So, all right. So, Susan, let's just look at this one more time and see if I've left you high and dry here. Do I have a? Oops, I just did a bad thing there. Let's see if I can look at any others of these drawings and find. I think I've covered that. I think the floating line thing, you can just see it everywhere. I'm going to look down the bottom of this lower Degas. Yeah. There's all those lines in these various legs in this model here that would have been in that category, right? Now this is in the sense of floating. I do mean floating, putting a piece of a line that is a useful piece that you can set up here and then get something going down here to get an angle before you start drawing everything in between. Remember, it was Degas who said anybody drew a line with that much authority, so you may be talking about a line like this or a line like this, must have known where he was starting and where he was going to end. Well, what happens over here is that you articulate something, like with a true shape, like he's done here, and down here you articulate something else, and then it's considerably easier to lay a traced, let's say a memorized line on that. But floating, speculative lines, so longer leg lines here. He put the leg down, then he decided to move it. That's not quite in the same category as floating lines, but if you do your first ones lightly enough, they can be virtually that. Remember, these first lines out there are speculation, and the next thing you're going to do is you make use of them. Don't erase them. Make use of them to put the next level of, the next strongest lines, the next ones when you make your next attempt, you're going to go a little bit darker. Make really good use, and don't feel like you need to tear away these original lines, especially if the drawing is just being made for a picture, which most drawings are. If you're making drawings for art, I mean, you're in a different class, and I'm not even talking about that really, even though those kinds of drawings would still be set up the same way, but in terms of floating lines. So that should cover that, and thank you, both of you, for those questions, and get back to me if I haven't answered them in an adequate way. But in the case of the floating line, Susan, go back and look at the video we put up, okay? All right. Thank you very much. See you next time.